Can you understand this, Demerzel?
Not all of it. Not yet. But I can already see that wonderful things lie ahead.
Foundation's second season ended with another promise to jump forward through time between seasons. This time for 152 years. And before we all prepare for our own kind of cryosleep to wait for Season 3, it seems like the perfect time to look at all the questions we're left with. Before we get into them, there is a script for a scene that was cut from the Season 2 finale that was released online that added a postscript for the Terminus storyline. It's an account of the vault landing on the Foundation's new home, which has the very creative name New Terminus, and the scene was cut for budgetary reasons. I suppose it's not essential for the ending of Season 2, but showrunner David S. Goyer released it on his blog because it would have been a nice addition to the finale and provided some more details about Dr. Seldon's plans. The scene breaks down like this. The vault arrives on an Earth-like planet that is undetected in the Imperial registry. It's completely off the grid, it sounds like a real upgrade from the original Terminus, and you see all the survivors who were in the vault shuffle out to explore. Dr. Seldon seems pleased to see his plan working out, as is Brother Constant. A couple of days pass, and there's a scene with Paulie waking up in his tent where he removes his vestments and goes out in civilian clothes. He makes his way to the vault where Seldon remarks that he barely recognizes him without the robes. He says he hopes it doesn't mean he's having a crisis of faith because he'd been planning on the cleric becoming their new leader. Paulie responds, no, not of faith. And when pressed, he explains the faith he's lost is in Dr. Seldon. This isn't because he sent Paulie and Constant to their likely deaths on Trantor, but because he didn't give them the choice. Both of them would have been glad to make that sacrifice, but rather than giving the option, he chose to lie to them. On top of that, when he killed the warden, it didn't bother him. Paulie even suspects that he enjoyed it, and when Seldon repeats that a god has to be many things, Paulie reminds him that he's not a god. He's just someone who used violence to prove a point, and that sounds a lot like Empire. Seldon keeps his cool and doesn't let on that any of this bothers him. After he asks Paulie to leave, and there's a funny moment where Paulie realizes he's at the exact same place where the warden met his end, there's a final shot of Dr. Seldon that makes it clear that Paulie's words did bother him a great deal. So this helps to set the stage for what's to come for the new generations of Foundationers. There are nice parallels to Demerzel on Trantor, and the story on Ignis with a direct tie into Gaal's mention of a future crisis that was a showdown between the two Harrys. A couple of quick things before we talk about the different stories. First, there does appear to be a Season 3 coming. There's no official announcement, it hasn't been ordered, but they did put together a writer's room and write the scripts, and even got started with some pre-production before the writer's strike hit. Because of the strike, there's been no announcement, and we probably won't know anything official until that ends, but it seems like Season 2 performed pretty well, so it should be happening. For most of what I read or listened to in my own conversations with Goyer, it does seem like we'll be picking up in the era of the Mule. Each season so far has ended with a coda to tease what's to come, and I imagine they'll follow the same format of picking up right after that scene time-wise. Knowing that this scene to show their arrival on New Terminus was written is further evidence of this because after that conclusion, what they become, like what it develops into, is a lot more interesting than the actual development. This would have the effect of bringing in a new crop of characters, and at the end of our interview, all the names he threw out there, Beta, Tauren, Randu, Ebling Miss, and Magnifico, are all names of characters from the Mule storyline. Of course, the enduring characters will all return, and you can't rule out seeing some of the dead ones still play a part. I actually wouldn't be surprised if we saw even more of Salvor and Gaal's story than we did of Rach. Other than that, most of the characters who survived the finale should be dead, though I expect that on New Terminus there will be a descendant or descendants that are the result of Constant and Hover's coupling. There is one obvious choice based on the books, but Mr. Goyer likes to mix things up, so I wouldn't say you can count on that. There are a few questions about New Terminus that I've been going around in circles on. I presume that part of Harry's plan was to cripple Empire's fleet and have the Spacers leave so that the Foundation would be able to prosper off of Whisper ship technology. I still think that's the most likely direction for things to go, with the weakened dynasty flailing around at a huge disadvantage, but I'm not 100% sure how Dr. Seldon fits into things. This is because the show introduced 2 inflection points based on outliers, which will affect the plan. We don't know how Gaal's ability to see the future, and more directly her identifying the mule, will change things for her and Harry. And we don't know how much Salvor's going to Terminus to talk to Dr. Seldon will disrupt things on that side. Without them, the Empire continues to fall apart. The Foundation gains power and influence, and the Second Foundation nudges things back on track when necessary. As Season 2 comes to a close, Dr. Seldon appears to be going into hiding, and Hari and Gaal are setting things up for her to be the air quotes sleeper goddess who has her own mentalic army. The deviations here could indicate a direct flip between the role of the Foundations, as my friend Aaron from Bald Move brought up in the live stream we did together, but there is still a need for the Foundation to fill the void that's created as Empire loses its influence over the galaxy. So it's hard to imagine Dr. Seldon staying off the radar forever. Of course, there were several other planets loyal to the Foundation by the end of the season, and one of those could step up to be the public-facing capital. But then in the show's version of events, you would anticipate another showdown between Vault Harry and the Cleons. He gave Demerzel the Prime Radiant so that he could spy on her, or at least that seems like the most obvious reason. He technically doesn't have a Radiant, but you'd presume that he made a duplicate or can read it through the vault without a physical copy. There's probably more to this, which we'll come back around to when we talk about Demerzel. But if you have the option to keep the Cleons around and set up another showdown between Lee Pace and Jared Harris, I think you find a way to make that happen. Another conflict they seem to be heavily foreshadowing is that showdown between the 2 Harrys I mentioned earlier. I don't see a direct path to Ignis Harry holding real power beyond the Mentalics and in relation to the Mule, so that would also make me think that Dr. Seldon's influence on the Rising Foundation would be known. That would be public knowledge. At least 152 years later. They could go the direction of everyone thinks that Terminus is destroyed and that everyone from the Foundation is gone, including Dr. Seldon and the Vault. That might work in the short term to make them look like martyrs and to continue that religious path, but Seldon himself seemed to state it as a fact that they would be moving on from that phase. And either way, he's already a god, so one that can actually interact with people tends to be a lot more powerful. Regardless of how any of that comes together, one thing we know for sure is that the Mule will play a big part in injecting some chaos into the galaxy. As important as that will be, there aren't many obvious questions about the situation if you haven't read how that turns out in the books. He's an outlier. And that really causes problems because psychohistory can't predict him. In the show, Gaal has seen him, so that takes us back to how that knowledge will affect the trajectory of the Second Foundation. Will they be focused on him when they should be doing other things? We'll have to wait and see. The other thing about the Mule that I imagine viewers will debate until we know for sure what the answer is who he actually is and where did he come from. I do know where he came from in the books, but I don't expect it to be the same in the show. I actually thought his origins might not be terribly important, but Goyer did say in my interview that the writers knew who he was when they were writing Season 2. That leads me to believe that there will be a connection, someone we know, or at least one of the 3 places will be spending time, but I think you could make a case for all of them if you really wanted to, so it really is anyone's guess. One character who I guess will be a candidate for Mule theories will be the child that Sareth is carrying at the end of episode 10. Personally, I don't think this makes a lot of sense, but I suppose you never know. And if you discount the actor we've already seen as being the Mule, then I guess that would create a backdoor way that Lee Pace could take the role. Now that we know for sure that Brother Dawn and Queen Sareth got away, it is a big question as to what will come of that, what their child will mean for the story. Perhaps more importantly, what influence will that inflection point have 152 years down the road? That will likely relate to the enigma that is Demerzel, who, to be fair, we learned a lot more about in this season. She is a prisoner to her directive thanks to Cleon the First's reprogramming, and this bit of information both provided some clarity about why she does what she does, while also undermining some theories that I had coming out of Season 1, and then also just brought up a ton of new questions. Learning about Cleon's law and the way it supersedes the other laws, which as far as the 3 laws are concerned, those had already been removed or superseded, makes you wonder what is Demerzel's motivation beyond the situation she's in. If she wasn't compelled by the 3 laws during the Robot Wars, then what was superseding them? Because things get tricky if she was leading robot soldiers who were fighting for their personhood. Something made that possible, if we're to believe the propaganda, and when he was recounting that, Dusk did say that robots fought robots. So there's no guarantee what side she was on, or what faction she was with, but even if you knew the answer to that, there would be unanswered questions that would follow. This is a bigger question, or bigger questions that are all superseded by her desire to break free from serving the dynasty. And before you start spamming the comments with book spoilers, I do know what the characters' motivations are in the books, and their relationship with the laws. But having said that, I'm not sure the show is portraying the character the same way. For people who are just watching the show, and for Season 3 specifically, the biggest question is what can she actually do given her current restrictions? Her goal is to be free, but she's compelled to make sure that doesn't happen. There is a possibility that Dr. Seldon understands this, and that's part of what motivated him to give her the Prime Radiant. There was a lot going on between these 2 characters in the vault that should raise your eyebrows. He made it clear that he knew she was a robot and that she was programmed to serve Empire. This is not public knowledge. This is an indication that they already knew each other or that someone else gave him that information. I guess you can't rule out that his work with psychohistory revealed this, but that doesn't really make any sense. The other thing he said was that he knew precisely how and when the Cleons will end. That is something that's predicted by psychohistory, and something that Demerzel might be able to ascertain by looking at the Prime Radiant. Would that change her directive? Knowing with mathematical certainty how the dynasty she's compelled to serve would end? Maybe? I don't know, it seems like a stretch. In reality, it seems like it should make her try harder to figure out how to stop it, but who knows? What's more interesting to me, and what I think was more interesting to Asimov, is the conflicts that exist inside the laws. Seldon brings this up as well when he asks how she decides what serves Empire best. It's not a black and white proposition like the first law, for instance. Do not harm a human is pretty straightforward, but the Empire's best interests are more complicated. So all of that is to say that a really interesting question about Demerzel is how she navigates that conflict, and how she can use that uncertainty to her advantage. I hope that's something they'll really lean into in Season 3. We learned a couple of specific things that will likely be important. Her brain is decentralized, she is loyal to the Cleonic Empire above everything else, and she can't transfer herself out of her body. There have to be some loopholes there for a superintelligence with nothing but time to try to figure it out. The Empire should be in a much different place without spacers to navigate their jump ships. This will likely have a crushing effect on their reach and influence for the better part of the 152 years between seasons. I'm interested to see how they emerge from that. How the genetic drift continues to alter the exponents. Will there be any other strange ones that come out of that? And ultimately, how Demerzel keeps it all together. She certainly looked pleased with what she saw inside the Radiant at the end of episode 10. But she's been around for more than 18,000 years, so who's to say when or where those wonderful things that she sees lying ahead will come to pass? As far as the spacers are concerned, it seemed like they played their role in relation to where we're at now. It seemed like their stated goal was to enjoy their freedom and flow beyond the galaxy, so I wouldn't expect them to play a big part in Season 3. At the same time, they do seem like the perfect kind of group that could just be out there somewhere in case you need someone to show up at the last minute down the road, so maybe they'll come back in a later season. To look backwards towards season 1, there are still some lingering questions that this season didn't answer. We learned that the vault was even more impressive than we initially thought, and it was already somewhat magical. Where did this thing come from? It appears to surpass Empire's technology and all the other technology we've seen for that matter, and Hari was a mathematician. There was nothing in his background to indicate he should be able to put something like this together. It's a total mystery, just like the Starbridge attack. Before we learned about Cleon's law, I would have guessed that Demerzel was the only character we'd met that was powerful enough to pull something like either of these things off. Now that would appear to lead to impossible conflicts. It's almost like there has to be another being that is on her level out there, because the show hasn't really set up any other groups that wield power in a way that would be comparable to what she can do, or could in any way threaten her. It did mention the Galactic Council in the Season 1 finale, and then included them in some key scenes in Season 2. Dusk name-checks them at the announcement ceremony for the wedding, and that stood out to me when I was making that video because of that mention in the Season 1 finale. They seem to be a group that Empire has to answer to, but they've been pretty vague about how that actually works. They were also present for Polly and Constance's execution, and then the most interesting thing was that they were with Demerzel when she was watching the destruction of the fleet on the holo display. I think all of that adds up to evidence that they'll play a role going forward, and they do seem to be powerful politically. But I would guess that their role would be related to making things difficult for the dynasty after the Terminus debacle. Callie is a character that might be a better fit to be someone out there influencing things behind the scenes. She appears to be a robot, and she first appeared inside the Prime Radiant in a space that resembles the technology of the Vault. Hari didn't appear to recognize her as Calais, or make any obvious connections when she appeared to him there or on Una's world. But if she can give him a body, how can you be sure she didn't give him the tech to create the Vault? Or even though we know he worked on it with Yana, they did seem to solve some pretty big problems in creating the Prime Radiant. And if she can appear as Yana whenever she came to him at first inside the Radiant, why wouldn't she pretty much be able to appear as anyone? It is a mystery to solve a mystery. There's not that much direct evidence to connect the dots, but for now, she seems like the most likely candidate. And that makes her the biggest question I have going into Season 3. And I think that is a great place to leave things. I'm interested to hear what your questions are and what you're hoping to find out. Hopefully the strike will end soon. Hopefully they'll pay the writers and the actors what they deserve and we can get this ball rolling again. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.